Thank you so much for joining us today. Today we have Dr. Bill Code, of course, our esteemed guest. He's been a medical advisor to Point of Return for 16 years. One of his areas of expertise is immune health, understanding virology, and of course the coronavirus is something that's on everybody's mind. So this is the second podcast in this series, and we will continue to do them to bring you both current information as well as ways to strengthen your immune system and protect yourself from this virus. So first, I'd like to welcome Dr. Bill Code. Dr. Code, thank you so much for taking time.
Well, it's great to be back with you again today. I think we can offer people some degree of wisdom in this very turbulent times.
Yeah, right now, I think one of the great fears of people is they see so few number of cases that are actually documented, and rule out Italy, of course, and Iran in the more hotspot, but in the US, Canada. And a lot of people are getting a false sense of security, realizing that 80% of the people, of course, may not have any symptoms, may have minimal symptoms, but they're carriers. And I think what people don't realize, and I've been explaining time and again, is that the way to contain this virus is to get the numbers that are exposed down, because the 20% that do have issues are overwhelming our medical system. Okay.
Well, that's right. We've got to, as the favorite term these days is flatten the curve so our medical system can start to keep up. So I think we've got several good things starting to happen. I mean, the governor of New York, they've moved now to 16,000 tests people per day from 1,000. So we will soon know in a very big population, what is the incidence out there? So I think the other thing that we can take from this virus, I think most people, by the time they have the virus for a week to 2 weeks, they're probably not carrying it anymore, which is good. It used to be that concept. It has some closest parallels probably in our current knowledge and thinking for most of us is hepatitis C. Hepatitis C is also an RNA virus. And yes, people can be relative carriers for that, but it's, again, droplet spread, mucus system spread. But this virus, fortunately, is a little bit closer to the HIV virus, which of course is maybe a part of its segment, in that it doesn't survive a long time outside the body. So that's good. Certainly 24 hours is probably lots. Some would suggest 6 and 8 hours. It depends, partly because it's on drying surfaces. When you use alcohol, it's not the time that it's wet with the alcohol that matters, it's as it dries, because it tends to break down the virus. And just to spend a moment on that, I know everybody's getting very good at the 20-second hand washing, getting all those surfaces, including the fingertips, including the web spaces, and including the back of the hand. Okay, so you cover all those bases with soap and water. And it doesn't matter whether it's liquid soap or bar soap, as long as you get a really good lather going, you can really clean that up. However, the secondary part of that is don't reach for the antibacterial soaps, because the antibacterial may be antibacterial, but they're certainly not antiviral. They don't work. So triclosan, which I don't like anyway, because it tends to get into your central nervous system and cause depression and mood changes and so on. In fact, some of these antibacterial soaps have been withdrawn from the FDA for that simple problem. Don't think that antibacterial means antiviral. It does not. Those are different deals. So back to the virus itself. The viruses are part of us all the time. They're part of our microbiome through our entire body. In fact, when these viruses create something to create spread, they're pinching off a little piece of one of our cells. I mean, this is all part and parcel. Within a year or two, 80% of the planet will have this virus as part of their system. Okay, so we have to come to grips with that. Yes, we need to slow down flatten the curve, because we really need to protect our social distancing, 2 meters, some areas are now down to a minimum of 2 people together, or sorry, a maximum of 2 people together. So the numbers are coming down. If you're in your own secluded group in your family, then hopefully all those pieces are fine and work well. But we have to take a break. We have to go out a lot less. And this is especially key, I think, in Canada, United States, because it's still coming here to a great degree, although it's here a lot more than we think. And I think when we get enough numbers, and it may be out of New York in the first place, we may find that there's a lot more people had it than we thought had it, but they didn't notice that they had it. So then who needs to worry about if they're going to get it? Well, everybody should worry a little. The young can worry less, but lots of us have 1 or 2 or 3 health challenges. And we learned that in Italy, didn't we? Over half all the people that died had 3 health problems. So it might be cardiovascular disease with diabetes, or maybe they had chronic obstructive pulmonary disease as well. You take those 3 strikes and add in the virus, and your chances of survival are much reduced. And then almost everybody else that died had at least one of those problems. And the problems, again, of course, cardiovascular disease, the big one in there is hypertension. And
why hypertension?
Well, hypertension, this virus works on the ACE, so the angiotensin converting enzyme. So it's a piece of the cell that's very prevalent in the lung. It's activated by something from the kidney. And in hypertension, that is out of whack. So there's probably more places for the virus to attach in that individual. We were having worries for a time that those particular group of drugs which acted on that enzyme, the jury's out right now. It might be protective or it might be less than protective. So probably the wise thing to do, stay on the protocols you're on now, but know that you're a little more at risk with having a problem with the virus. So you have to be extra vigilant. I mean, we had our kids home on the weekend. They were picking up their sons, their grandkids. And my son was in tears when he left because he's worried that the old people, my wife and I, because we're 66 years old, we're vulnerable and at high risk. And I'm very dissuaded by his passion, for us. But, we're working really hard, as everyone can in your own milieu, to keep things under control. So this morning, both Denise and I, we went in for hyperbaric oxygen. We know that everybody doesn't have access to that, but we do know that it's a piece of keeping your immune system in shape. And we've alluded to some of the things to keep your immune system in tip-top order for this critical time. And so we'll go through some of those again today, like the glutathione enhancement with support, the optimal whey protein group, as well as, the vitamin C. Vitamin D is absolutely huge. And we're starting to get into spring, but where I live, up just around the 49th parallel, there still isn't any vitamin D making rays in the sunshine. Now you're down in South Carolina, so you've got them pretty well year round. It doesn't work up here. It's not just because of the rain and the fog, it's because the angle coming through the sun. So take that vitamin D, and if you haven't been taking it, load with it. Take 10,000 units a day for a month of vitamin D3. Very expensive, very available, and no reason not to.
I think that's one of the reasons for the high outbreaks in certain areas, because there's an epidemic of low vitamin D. Certainly in New York, certainly in Washington, United States.
Well, they're the 2 highest risks in the United States, absolutely. Well, maybe Alaska's up there too, but there isn't as many numbers in those. But it's a very big deal. Although you get the problem happening in other states, it's not as dramatic around the equator, and this may be one of the biggest reasons. The other thing is it's a bit heat sensitive. I mean, drinking super hot fluids, you're still going to burn yourself, and super hot fluids aren't going to knock out the virus particularly well. So, you want to carry on with your vitamin C, at least 2 grams a day. And we'll talk a little bit maybe about Merrick's protocol, where he uses 1.5 grams of vitamin C every 6 hours. He uses thiamine 200 milligrams twice a day. So I'm saying the economy way to do that is your B complex, B complex 50 or B complex 100 twice a day. Sure, it's very inexpensive because it's readily available and it's easy to find, but it lets your body be in tip-top condition as far as we talked about a little bit before, detoxification, whether it's handling toxins from the infection or where it's handling toxins from the medication that we've been on or trying to get off, whether that's benzodiazepines or opiates, because each of those tend to suppress our immune system. So we've got to do everything we can to tip-top against it. And then even those, modest amounts of zinc, 15 to 30 milligrams per day, or selenium, 100 micrograms per day. Each of these makes some difference to that immune system being in good shape so that we can, handle it when we get it.
We're one of the 80%, basically.
Well, that's right. We are almost all going to get this virus, just like almost everybody will get the flu virus. And just to clear up something, there's some centers that are saying, go out and get your flu virus now to protect yourself. Actually, not true. If you have the flu virus vaccination, you're a little more at risk with this particular virus because it's got some flu components in it, but it's dominant other things. It's dominant the SARS virus, which was COVID-1, and this was originally called COVID-2, and now we call it COVID-19 because it turned up in 2019.
A couple questions about that. I mean, China, their outbreak was dramatic. I do think they held back information, which is one of the reasons it spread. But they seem to have already broken, that curve. The majority.
Well, they have broken the curve, but they're extremely dramatic. When they insist on a quarantine, they make it work. Sure, that's not ideal, perhaps, but they've also made great strides against it in places like Singapore and Hong Kong. These are very crowded, populated places. And South Korea. One of the reasons South Korea has been successful, a lot of their sick people, they got extra oxygen, which is a big deal. Not everybody can do that. But the other thing is they tested really early. So they knew and they started to realize who could go out into because if 80% of the people have it in the population, and you know that they're over the so-called carrier stage, hopefully, then that's going to really improve your resources. Ideally, you would have healthcare workers who happen to have resistance to it now because they've had it. We don't have a vaccine, but let's at least protect our healthcare workers. I mean, there's a lot of physicians, over 20 have died in Italy now, most of them in that Lombardo region, because anytime you take your healthcare worker like any other person, if they work terribly long hours, very stressed with people, that they can't help long enough, then their immune system just goes down into the tube and they won't handle the virus themselves and you'll lose them.
And that's exactly what's happening. So will our bodies eventually build like an antibody as we do? Is it just that none of us have ever seen this virus?
No, that's exactly what it is. It's a relatively new virus for us. The SARS virus was decimating. Everybody that got it got really extremely sick. And this is a very close cousin of that. But it's different in that some people will get extremely sick, 15, 20%, but 80% won't get very sick at all. And you'll have less symptoms than you would from maybe an ordinary flu. So you don't have the same marker and ease of assessing who has it and who doesn't. That makes it harder, but it makes it somewhat reassuring that the majority of people will do okay. There was an interesting internal memo from a major New York firm today saying that, well, we don't have to worry about this. It just kills old people. Well, now that I'm one of the old people, I don't really like that attitude. And being divisive is not going to help anybody.
No, but I have heard that, I do wonder if certain genetic markers make you more vulnerable. For instance, if you don't detoxify well, that's going to.
Of course. The people that don't detoxify well, just because of their own particular genetic makeup, they're always at risk. They're the canaries in the coal mine. You can give them amalgams in their mouth, and some of them will get really sick, whereas the other people seem to tolerate it pretty well for most of a lifetime. So it's exactly down to those pieces. And now more and more people are learning if they're having troubles with that. Some of the many people that you see, some of the toughest ones to solve the problem, they have the detoxification problem. So everything really bubbles up in that group. I'm probably in that group too. So I've come to realize it over time. I really try to boost my glutathione, keep that vitamin D on the record, keep up my B vitamins, because that makes a very big difference in a lot of us with the MTHFR, the
Absolutely.
methyl groups and so on. So we need to know our individuality. Sure, that's a good, but we need to take it further. We can't change our blood type. I'm type A, which is, I think, a little more at risk probably than type O, of which is some of my family, but I can't change that part. But I can change the epigenetics. Remember, epigenetics, big factor is vitamin D. So please, please take it. Big factor is your microbiome. And I haven't touched on it too much, but I will a little bit again boost up that bifidus. Bifidus seems to counteract the Prevotella, which is one of the bacteria which seems to team up with COVID-19. The Prevotella is not optimal in us. And many of us that are sick and have reduced microbiome diversity, we've got excess Prevotella. So that's making it a happier hunting ground or home for the COVID-19 virus. So you can improve that. Green tea makes a big difference. Curcumin can make a difference. Bifidus boosting, not so much lactobacillus. Lactobacillus, which is what many of us tend to reach for in a probiotic, it has its advantages, but it tends to enhance Prevotella. So we don't really want to reach for it at this point in time. Reducing your grain intake. It's not a bad time, maybe to go mostly gluten-free. You've got to hunker down in your home. You can't change everything, but try and increase your fruits and vegetables and bring down your grains, because the grains tend to enhance, again, that Prevotella group. So you want that broadened biodiversity, because the microbiome is our most powerful epigenetics. Epigenetics means turning your good genes on and turning your not so good genes off. And so that's what all of us can do. We've only got 23,000 approximate genes, and so we really make a difference to those.
Wonderful. For anyone watching that's on medications or on the point of return protocol, please remember to look at the interaction guide or contact our office regarding any items that we mentioned today. Okay, so please, everybody.
Yeah.
Or those that are, just do check in. It's incredibly important.
Well, that's right, because I'm suggesting some things which are not optimal within the protocol. So that's right. They should review it with you guys, you folks, and sort that out, because we need to take ourselves through the challenging time until we can get it right. Boosting that support, I think I said last time, if you're doing some, double it, because as you tolerate all of these steps better, you will come through this better. The same with the diabetics. Diabetics, a high risk group. Please keep that control, the optimizing the blood sugar as good as you can. It really helps to focus. But it's another reason why try and look at this with a big picture perspective rather than fear only, because fear drives down our immune system. So do your 4, 7, 8 breaths, which I talk about in my mindfulness chapter that I learned from Dr. Andrew Weil, because each of these calming pieces calms down the immune system and makes it more healthy and better to respond.
What is it about diabetes that poses such a threat with this virus?
Well, it's probably the fact that high sugars, every time you get a high sugar spike, you get a high insulin spike, and you get a high inflammation spike. So this virus, and I've got a quote here from William Osler, who is, of course, a Canadian, but he started Johns Hopkins along with 2 or 3 other physicians. So it's pretty major. Except for a few occasions, patients appear to die from the body's response to infection rather than from it. So I mention that right now because when people do poorly with the ARDS, acute respiratory distress syndrome, which is the byproduct in the lungs that injures everybody so badly and can kill them, it's almost always that cytokine storm inside. So too many inflammation molecules. So if diabetes boosts those inflammation molecules and they're already high, when they go super high, you're in a more difficult position and you're less likely to get back to baseline.
And thus the need to not do gluten because gluten raises inflammation.
Of course. You know, it's hard to tell everybody now that they're home and they don't have any gluten-free bread that maybe they're not going to focus on that. So, you know, have them do the best things they can. Reach for those lentils and the other products better, legumes or legumes, as I might call them. Each of these things, you can only work on one devil at a time, usually. Some of us can work on two if we're really good at it, but it's tricky to work on everything. Right now, I want people to optimize their ability to go through this because in the next few months, this will be solved by one means or another, and it'll be calmed down. We need to, don't say that we're going to be okay when we get the vaccination, because most of us are going to have exposure long before the vaccination turns up a year.
That's true. Is it continuing to mutate, the coronavirus, or is it pretty steady strand?
Well, I think we haven't got the wherewithal to study that. It takes a little longer. It's not just our regular testing, which can tell us, is the virus changing or not? So we have to, you know, look at bigger epidemiologic pieces. And I'm sure that they're starting to work that out now. It's likely it's continuing to mutate some. That's what most viruses do. That's how they do well. And that's how they peak so much in bats, for example, because the bats have a super dynamic immune system. They can handle most viruses in 24 hours. It'll take you and I 7 to 14 days. So it's not going to be as quick. So the mutation is probably occurring to some degree because there's large numbers. I mean, we looked at the H1N1 viruses, there was 4 strains, and there's going to be several strains to this at the end of the day.
So the mutation from the virus is what it does to protect itself as it continues to alter, or is it the interaction with different immune systems that causes
both
it?
Of the above. Both of the above.
Okay.
So any mutation will tend to improve the survival of the virus. So sometimes it makes it tougher, sometimes it makes it so it can transmit a little further, maybe 7 feet instead of 6 feet, but all these happen over time. But just by the sheer numbers game, the more numbers you have happening, the more mutations occur.
So that's
the numbers game.
Yeah, control the.
Some of that will happen. Some of the mutations will make the virus less strong. Okay? Not all mutations happen for a straightforward reason. They're just a change, and some of them will reduce the power of the virus, and some of them will increase it. But we can't predict which one.
Okay. What do you foresee? I mean, just to give people a little bit of hope, what kind of time frame do you think, at least within North America, I think there are some extenuating circumstances with Italy that it's still growing. But what do you think within Canada and the US as far as flattening this curve if people do quarantine?
Well, if people self-quarantine and stay really conscientious with it, and everybody's amping that up, they're certainly amping it up where I live. I went into the bank yesterday or a few days ago, and I had 3 questions to get in. You know, had I been out of the country? Had I contacted somebody who had? Did I have symptoms of the virus? And then, you know, because it was a very restricted number. I got up to the bank teller because this particular transaction, I needed a person, and she was pretty cautious. She was standing at upper length from her counter. And so I backed up from mine. We were trying to maintain that 2 meters, 6, 7 feet distance. And then I think we got away okay. And so we went on from there. Everybody's almost cashless now because, I mean, even my post office, they want a debit or credit card. They didn't want to have cash. So waving at your phone over something and paying that way or paying with your credit card on a tap, Each of those interact less among us. You're not doing much at restaurants. Pretty well all the restaurants are closed.
That's right.
Fair enough. Some of them are doing pretty well at a takeout business. I guess if virus doesn't live too well on cardboard, that's good news for us. We can still get stuff in the mail and all these little things. But yeah, it's interesting.
Do you think we're looking at another few weeks, a couple of months? What do you think?
Yeah, I think there will be a lot of understanding in a couple of months. And I'm hoping within 1 month, but I'm not optimistic about it. I've got meetings, scientific meetings around the world. They've all been canceled right up till the end of May. And even our major Rotary International meeting in Honolulu has now been canceled, and it was in June. And those are probably wise steps, because how dare you bring people from all over the world and put them in a melting pot? I mean, there was a big issue within Vancouver. 2 or 3 weeks ago, they had 1,500 dentists from all across the country, and I'm sure some from the US. And unfortunately, there was a few people at that meeting that were COVID-19 positive. So that really made a big difference all around the country. And so almost all dental offices are closed right now.
Yep, my appointment was canceled as well. Can we go through a couple of the options? Because I know that a lot of people right now cannot get, various hand sanitizers. Can we look at options like such as would peroxide work?
Hydrogen peroxide usually works really well. A weak bleach solution works really well. Ozone, if you can ozonate your water, that works really well. What we're trying to do is break down the outside of the virus. And that's why soap is particularly effective, because it breaks down that lipid layer of the outside of the virus. And it breaks open, it's toast. But, most of us have a liquor cabinet. So fine, instead of drinking that vodka, I don't like vodka much, so I'm easy to use the vodka first. It's 40% alcohol. That's not as strong, so you're going to need to use a little bit more of it, washing it on and off. I mean, remember our spaghetti westerns of years ago, they poured on whiskey, and that made some benefit. You would like a higher alcohol, but it's a way better than nothing, and just use a little more volume over a little more time, and you will have some of the same benefit as getting up to 90%.
Okay, and for the bifidus bacteria, would fermented foods, if people can't get out to get a probiotic, what would help?
Well, fermented foods tend to help. Boosting your legume intake seems to help. Legume, where I'm talking. And each of those features, but the diversity of the fruits and vegetables. Sometimes there's a probiotic that will boost bifidus. And certainly there's a lot of our probiotics out there in the milieu. Bifidus is one of the 2 big ones. And so take one that leans toward bifidus at this moment.
Okay. What about the transmission to animals? I've seen a couple of concerns, and a lot of our clients have asked about the transmission to their dogs or cats.
Yeah, it doesn't, live very well on them. It's not hard to imagine, that if I kiss my dog and someone else kisses the dog right after, or even pets the dog with a contaminated hand, and then someone else does it right after, it's going to be some issue, but it's not going to be a very dramatic issue. It doesn't do that well on those surfaces because it's going to dry right away. Drying doesn't tend to treat this virus well. It does better, with components of some degree of moisture around it. I think the likelihood of infecting our pets is almost zero, happily. So that's a good news piece, because some people value their pets every bit as much as themselves, and I respect that, wish. So I don't think we're going to have any problems, but it's about the same as, taking a glass, holding onto it with your whole contaminated hand, handing the glass to someone else, they put their hand on it, and now it's contacted. So it's a potential contact surface, but it's pretty minimal because it won't last very long on the surface of that cat or dog.
Okay, so you think we're looking at least a few more weeks?
Oh, we are. Yeah.
And
we can do this every week or two and watch how it comes along. It's 10 days since we did our last, COVID-19 discussion together, and there's been huge changes in that. We've learned a lot about pieces since then. There's even, a couple of old drugs that are getting talked about. I think the one reason so the 2 drugs are azithromycin, which is kind of an antibiotic. It's one that we had on hand because we went down into, parts of Mexico or the other places where there's different flora, and you might get a rip-roaring turista or whatever you want to call it, and then we tend to treat that. So that is one that's been around a long time. It's an antibiotic, and people take, I think, 500 milligrams once a day for 6-7 days when the virus is peaking in them. And they do that in combination with hydroxychloroquine, which is also called Plaquenil. That's a drug we've had nearly 50 years. There's lots of talk about this. Trump talked about it, the FDA talked about it. Everybody says, well, it's off label. Yeah, well, if someone's dying, I've always been okay with going off label with a drug.
Right.
In anesthesia, every time we did a pediatric case, it was off label because they didn't do all the research protocols in children for anesthetics. How could they, or why would they afford them? So it was officially off label. Okay, fair enough. But you make a balanced, sensible clinical decision and you decide you might use it. So, and those two in combination have nearly had a 100%, certainly 99% benefit in people in France. And so a couple of major studies done there by major infectious disease specialists are talking about that. So these are starting to circulate among the milieu. And I think, so our chances are improving and improving and improving. You can't necessarily access those as an individual because they tend to be prescription agents. They're going to disappear in the locale pretty quickly. So if you have access or somebody has access and you're an incredibly vulnerable individual, you might think about that. I mean, I've had MS for 22 years now, and 23, I guess. I think about my friends with MS because they're vulnerable. Most people with MS often end with a pneumonia because we have more cardiovascular disease in the population. Doesn't surprise me because I think it's a vascular problem within the brain, within the veins, but especially a problem for those that are on an immunosuppressant drug. And that's the buzzword has been in MS for years, is get on that immune suppression because it's an immune problem. I don't agree with that, but for the folks that are on one, you are vulnerable. It's like being on a chemo agent for a cancer patient. They're incredibly vulnerable. I would hope that most people in their chemo journey or their radiation journey with their cancer, the oncologists are saying, we're going to stop this for a while. Or otherwise, we risk too highly losing you to COVID-19. You can back off for 2 weeks, 4 weeks. In most cases, it's not going to be life-changing.
No, but would you recommend for anyone that's immune compromised to go ahead and do, the antibiotic? Or...
Well, I would have it available, and I would look after my quarantine with gold letters.
Okay. Yeah. All right, Dr. Code. For anyone else watching, I can't stress the importance of getting Dr. Code's book, Solving the Brain Puzzle. There's a great deal on immune health and viruses. I mean, it's written for the layperson. So don't feel your doctor has to interpret. It's a wonderful book. And we also do give a discount for anybody watching the podcast. Use the word puzzle in the discount code, and you'll get a discount on the book. But it's an amazing book that I refer to most daily.
Because, of course, the book's called Solving the Brain Puzzle. But within the book is another piece that we haven't maybe mentioned on this, optimizing your immune system. One way to do that is protect yourself from electromagnetic fields, especially while you're sleeping at night. So turn off your Wi-Fi. Get rid of your hands-free phones. And if you have a hands-free phone, take the batteries out, turn off the main center at night, because it sends around messages all the time. And the brain can do its washing. Some of us are vulnerable even from this virus to a brain problem where it can potentially shut down the respiratory center. So that virus probably travels up the nerves from the lungs once the lungs are infected. So that's an extra good reason to try and have that better. But by protecting yourself and minimizing some of that, even your cell phone. Now your cell phone, nobody's talked about it much, but it's a great place to harbor viruses.
course.
Most of us have a cover over the viruses, but we're touching it many, many times a day. So wipe it down with alcohol. It may not be in the golden guideline. You can buy one of these devices. I saw them on a clip this morning. You know, you put it in and it does ultraviolet on your virus or on your phone, or take it outside in the sunshine. Go out, take a walk, wash it off. But if people are already doing their email and their FaceTime and Facebook, everything else, probably not FaceTime, while they're in the washroom, in the toilet, not a good idea. You got to clean up the phone too.
Yeah, but most homes right now, we have a lot of people that are, fully automated. Everything is, so it's shutting down the
We are. Let's shut it down at night. If you can hardwire it in your home, that's going to reduce it dramatically. I know it's a crisis. Everybody's at home now. Everybody's doing homeschooling or home university. And the Wi-Fi systems are choking because it wasn't ready for everybody to be home fully ramped up almost all the time. So yeah, we're going to have to share alike. I know in Europe, I think Netflix had to go from high density down to a more modest density. And we'll probably end up doing the same here in North America for the simple reason that people are trying to watch it. Well, they can't watch it, so now nobody can watch it. So there you go.
Yes, they're going to bring it down. But that is very, very true. And people have become too automated in every capacity. And there is a large section of your book also devoted to that. I learned a lot. And I did get some electromagnetic protectors. I mean, I really took that to heart.
Well, it's all those little pieces that we can make a difference to that lets us control our personal destiny. So we don't get to change what we go into this with. Maybe we've had a recent, lung cancer treated, but we're vulnerable in our lungs, or we've been a long time smoker, even though we quit 10 years ago, we still got that risk in our lungs. I mean, we've got a good friend, she was almost put on a lung transplant list 3 years ago, but by doing these things like, support and extra hyperbaric oxygen, she is now coaching at the request of a respirologist, coaching the other people. Well, what are you doing? Because you're doing pretty good. You're 3 years in. And most people would have slipped away. But she knows that she's super at risk, but she's still going to come up and get her hyperbaric oxygen because she feels that's enough difference to making her do well, okay, in the long term.
That's wonderful. And last time you also mentioned an oxygenator, a machine that could generate oxygen in the home. Can you cover that again, as well as how many liters it should produce?
Sure. So we've been about 20 years ago, maybe a little longer, we finally developed a just plug into your wall. It's a little bit like a miniature air conditioner, really, because it's got a compressor pump in it. It's got what we call a molecular sieve. So it takes in the air around us, which is 80% nitrogen and 20% oxygen, and it moves up to 95% oxygen. And 95% oxygen is virtually as good as 100% oxygen. Okay, so, trust me on that. And you just plug it in the wall and it works on 110 or it works on 220, whether you're in Europe or whether you're in North America, and it makes that 95% oxygen. And if you can get one that's at 5 liters a minute, you can sit with a mask I call it a non-rebreathing mask, and the mask is here, and then there's a reservoir bag underneath it. And that allows, while you're breathing out, extra oxygen flows into that bag. And now you can be breathing, if it's a pretty good fit around here, almost 70% oxygen.
Wow.
Because when people get into trouble, they usually get into shortness of breath or what we call air hunger. And that's because they know they're getting short of oxygen. So part of the problem that happens in the lungs and the injury that happens in the body goes into high metabolism. So that has a number of consequences. One is you need more oxygen to supply to the energy packets in the cell, the mitochondria, so they can work optimally. That high metabolism increases more reactive oxygen species, or so-called free radicals. Those aren't the guys necessarily out in the outback that we would call hippies. Those aren't the free radicals I'm talking about. I'm talking about reactive oxygen species. And contrary to occasional public story, the extra oxygen does not create more free radicals. The most of the free radicals come from lack of oxygen or so-called hypoxia. And they also come from the rapid metabolic rate. So that's why it's a way to settle it. I don't know if you've seen the 5-minute clip out of Italy where they had an emergency room, but everybody was kind of in a bubble or a hood, we would call them. And that allows them to deliver quite a bit more oxygen, maybe up to that almost 70%. And in many, many cases, then they don't need a ventilator. We don't have enough ventilators. And you can tell people to make more, but just telling them doesn't work. I mean, I noticed today that there's a 50% boost has been decreed in the hospitals in New York. Well, that's fine. You can decree it, but you sure can't do it in a minute because you haven't got the building, you haven't got the personnel. I mean, it sounds good politically, but it doesn't cut it in the short term.
Are there oxygenators that don't require a mask, that can just be delivering more oxygen to the room for the family, or is it really individual based?
Well, in a bigger base. So John West, he's kind of the father of oxygen without the body in lung physiology. And he wrote a marvelous article in the New England Journal a couple years ago. And I talk about it in the book because 1 minute of extra oxygen like that mask I talked about improves a teenager's thinking for 24 hours. Well, I'm not a teenager anymore, but if I can do it for a half an hour, probably it'll boost my brain for 24 hours. And that's why the very last section in my book is on hyperbaric oxygen. I talk about Edward Teller, the world famous physicist. 2 important things that it says even in that couple page letter that he wrote was that he got his hyperbaric oxygen unit for at home for his wife, who was given 2 or 3 months because of her lung disease. She lived more than 5 years with a good quality of life by doing that extra oxygen daily, almost in her entire life, or at least 6 days a week. And he went on to say, you know, I'm working, I'm in my 90s, he lived till 95, and you don't need to use extra oxygen if you're just reading the paper and watching the news. But if you want to work and use your brain, use it every day. So he did it 6 days a week for his entire life. And I'm doing it virtually 6 days a week at the minute. Partly for that reason, but partly also to optimize my immune system. So people can get access to the 5 liters. So I checked with our supplier and they're mostly out of supply because a lot of them, of course, come out of China. And consequently, you know, the supply has outstripped the demand. But you may be able to find one or know about one, or have a friend with one who no longer used it. The common place you could find them easily was someone had end-stage lung disease, they had one of these devices, and then they passed away. Well, the family doesn't know what to do with it, so they sell it online usually. And then you don't need a prescription from your doctor. They're pretty safe, but it's still dogma that for you to buy a new one, almost always you need a physician's signature in your state or in Canada. We can write them across provincial lines, but in your states, because you're more like individual countries than our provinces are.
Wonderful. Well, this was great information today, Dr. Code. I'd like to continue to do these podcasts for as long as this situation is occurring. I think it'll help to alleviate a lot of the fear, and
I think so. And you and I talked about it briefly ahead of time. So we'll try and put a list of 5 or maybe the top 10 things you can do to enhance your immune system. Even if you can't do every single one, do the ones that you can. Do the ones that you can reach to, because a lot of them, you can do in the short term. You can still get things delivered to your home and your house as far as supplements or whatever. But, just be reasonable and be kind to yourself and your family members. I guess in China, it was a huge crisis in divorce proceedings after everybody was together, because we've known that forever. I mean, it was two weeks over the Christmas season, lots of relationships are just right at their living edge because people haven't been to work. So try and control those pieces, because the more you can do that, the calmer you'll be, the better your immune system will be. Stress, harden immune system. So try de-stress.
Yeah, try being nice. Just be nice to each other. We're all going through this together.
Right.
Dr. Code, It's always a pleasure. Thank you so much, and we'll be on again in a few more days.
Okay, thank you again. Bye-bye.